It started as just another laid-back night on The Tonight Show until Matthew McConaughey noticed something that made him go completely still and changed everything. Studio 6B had that warm energy that came with certain guests. Tonight, Matthew McConaughey was back to discuss his latest film and philosophy book. The New York skyline glittered through the windows, creating the perfect backdrop for another captivating conversation filled with Matthew's philosophical insights. Jimmy had been looking forward to this interview for weeks. Conversations with Matthew always went beyond typical promotional material, touching on themes of personal growth and authentic living. What nobody noticed during the pre-show excitement was the woman in row 5, seat 8. Rebecca Martinez, 45 years old, sat perfectly still in her navy blue blazer, her hands folded carefully in her lap. On her left ring finger was a thin gold wedding band, cracked down the middle and held together with clear tape. Rebecca had won her tickets through a charity auction. The Tonight Show had always been her escape during the darkest nights. Jimmy's laughter, reminding her that somewhere in the world, people were still finding reasons to be joyful. The wedding ring had been beautiful once. A simple gold band David had placed on her finger 20 years ago, with promises of protection and love. But it had become a symbol of something else entirely. Each time it cracked, Rebecca would tape it back together, telling herself that if she could just keep the ring intact, maybe the marriage could be saved too. The show opened with Jimmy's characteristic warmth. When he introduced Matthew, the applause was sustained. 200 people showing appreciation for someone who had become synonymous with both entertainment excellence and philosophical depth. Matthew walked onto the stage in his signature relaxed style, wearing a simple gray shirt and dark jeans. He hugged Jimmy warmly, waved to the audience, and settled into the guest chair with natural ease. "Matthew McConaughey, everybody," Jimmy said, settling behind his wooden desk. "Thank you so much for being here. I have to start by saying your book has been incredibly influential. You write a lot about authentic living, about becoming who you really are. What does that journey look like for someone who's lost themselves along the way?" Matthew leaned back thoughtfully, his expression growing more contemplative. "You know, Jimmy, I think we all have moments where we realize we've been living someone else's version of who we should be. Sometimes it's subtle, sometimes it's more dramatic, like waking up one day and not recognizing the person in the mirror." As Matthew spoke, his eyes scanned the audience. That's when he saw her, Rebecca in row 5, unconsciously fidgeting with something on her left hand. His rhythm shifted slightly. Something about her posture, the way she kept touching her ring finger, spoke to Matthew in a language he recognized from his own journey through difficult relationships. "Actually, Jimmy," Matthew said, his voice taking on that deeper, more personal tone that signaled he was about to go somewhere unplanned. "I'm seeing something in the audience right now that's making me think about the symbols we carry, the things we hold on to even when they're not serving us anymore." Jimmy looked curious, but patient, sensing that Matthew was following one of those instincts that often led to the most meaningful moments. Matthew stood up and walked toward the edge of the stage, his eyes finding Rebecca again. "Ma'am," the lady in row 5 in the blue blazer. "I couldn't help but notice you keep touching your ring. Would you mind standing up for a moment?" Rebecca looked around frantically, pointing to herself with a shocked expression. The audience turned to look at her, and she felt her face flush with embarrassment. "Yes, you," Matthew said, gently. "I have a feeling that ring has a story. Stories are meant to be shared." Rebecca slowly stood up, her legs feeling unsteady. She looked down at her left hand, at the taped crack running through the middle of her wedding band, then back up at Matthew. "What's your name?" Matthew asked, his voice carrying clearly across the studio. "Rebecca," she replied, her voice barely audible, but carrying a strength that surprised her. "Rebecca Martinez." "Rebecca, that's a beautiful name," Matthew said. "And that ring you're wearing, It looks like it's been through some things. Would you mind sharing what's going on there? Rebecca's eyes immediately filled with tears. She looked down at the broken band, then back up at Matthew. The studio fell quieter, something in Rebecca's expression catching everyone's attention. It keeps breaking, Rebecca said, her voice getting stronger but heavy with years of accumulated pain. I keep trying to fix it, but it won't stay together anymore. Matthew felt something shift inside his chest. He'd been exactly where Rebecca was standing, not with a broken ring, but with broken pieces of himself that he'd kept trying to tape back together, believing persistence alone could heal wounds that required fundamental change. Rebecca, Matthew said softly, how many times have you fixed that ring? 7 times, Rebecca replied immediately, as if she'd been counting. Maybe 8. I've lost track. 7 times, Matthew repeated, and something in the way he said it suggested he understood the significance of that number. Rebecca, can I ask you something? What happens when you try to take it off? Rebecca's composure broke completely. I can't, she whispered. I've been wearing it for 20 years. I don't know who I am without it. Behind the scenes, Jimmy made a decision that would define this moment forever. He walked down from the stage and joined Matthew at the edge, both focused entirely on this woman carrying a symbol of something that had stopped serving her long ago. Rebecca, Jimmy said gently, can you tell us about those 20 years? They weren't all bad, Rebecca said, tears starting to flow more freely. In the beginning, it was beautiful. David used to say this ring meant I belonged to someone who would protect me. But somewhere along the way, protection became control. Love became fear, and I started breaking just like the ring did. Matthew felt a familiar anger rise in his chest, not at Rebecca, but at the systems that convinced people they had to stay broken to be loved. Rebecca, Matthew said, can I share something with you? Something I've never talked about publicly? Rebecca nodded, unable to speak. My father was a good man in many ways, Matthew began, his voice reflective. But he had this way of making my mother feel like she needed to be smaller to make him feel bigger. I watched her accommodate, adjust, apologize for taking up space in her own life. I swore I'd never be like that, but sometimes we repeat patterns we don't even recognize. Rebecca was listening with an intensity that suggested Matthew's words were unlocking something she'd been carrying alone for too long. That ring, Matthew said, pointing gently to Rebecca's hand, how does it feel when you touch it? Rebecca looked down at the broken band. Heavy, she said finally. Like carrying a weight that's not mine anymore. Rebecca, Matthew said, would you be willing to try something with me? What kind of something? Rebecca asked, looking both curious and terrified. I want to help you take that ring off, Matthew said simply. Not because I think you should, but because I think you deserve to know that you can. The audience murmured with anticipation, but this wasn't about entertainment. This was about liberation. I don't know if I'm ready, Rebecca said, her voice shaking. Ready is a luxury, Matthew said gently. Sometimes we have to act our way into readiness. Sometimes the only way to know who we are without something is to try being without it. Matthew made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. Rebecca, would you mind if I came up there? I have some experience with letting go of things that stopped working. Rebecca looked stunned. You'd really do that? I'd be honored, Matthew said, because I think you're about to discover something beautiful about yourself, and I don't want you to do it alone. Matthew McConaughey, one of the most recognizable actors in the world, left the stage and walked into the audience. The cameras followed him, but everyone understood that this wasn't about creating good television. This was about something more sacred. Matthew reached Rebecca's row and sat down next to her. For a moment, an Academy Award-winning actor and a domestic violence survivor sat together, connected by the shared understanding that some transformations require witnesses. Tell me about who you were before the ring, Matthew said simply. Rebecca's composure broke completely. I was going to be a teacher, she said through her tears. I loved children, loved helping them discover things about themselves. I had plans, dreams, opinions about everything. What happened to that woman? Matthew asked. She got quieter until she almost disappeared, Rebecca whispered. David said teachers didn't make enough money, said I was too sensitive. He made me smaller until I forgot I'd ever been anything else. Matthew reached over and gently placed his hand near Rebecca's, not touching the ring, but close enough that she could feel his presence. Rebecca, Matthew said, what would that teacher version of you say to the woman sitting here right now? Rebecca was quiet for a moment, accessing a voice she hadn't heard in years. She'd say, I deserve to take up space. That my gentleness isn't weakness. That leaving something that hurts you isn't giving up. It's growing up. Sounds like she's wise, Matthew said. How do you think she'd feel about that ring? Rebecca looked down at the broken band, then back at Matthew. She'd say it's not protecting me anymore. It's just a reminder of who I used to think I had to be. Matthew nodded slowly. Rebecca, I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer from that teacher part of yourself, not from the scared part. Are you ready to see who you are without that ring? Rebecca stared at the broken gold band for a long moment. Then she looked at Matthew, then at Jimmy, then at the entire studio audience who was holding space for her transformation. Yes, she said, her voice stronger than it had been in years. I think I am. Then let's do this together, Matthew said. What happened next was both simple and profound. Matthew gently supported Rebecca's hand while she slowly slid the broken wedding ring off her finger. The tape came away with it, leaving behind a thin, white line where the ring had been. The studio fell silent as Rebecca held the broken ring in her palm. How does that feel? Matthew asked softly. Rebecca flexed her fingers, touched the pale line, then looked up with something like wonder. Lighter, she said, and then she laughed. So much lighter. The audience erupted in applause, but it wasn't entertainment applause. It was recognition applause, acknowledgement of courage and transformation. But Matthew wasn't finished. He took the broken ring from Rebecca's palm and held it up to the studio lights. I want everyone here to see this ring, he said. Not because it's broken, but because breaking doesn't have to mean worthless. Sometimes breaking is how the light gets in. He turned to address the entire studio. Everyone, I want to tell you about Rebecca Martinez. 20 years ago, she put on this ring, believing it would protect her. Tonight, she took it off because she realized she could protect herself. Rebecca taught me something tonight, Matthew continued. She taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision that something else is more important than the fear. Her freedom was more important than her fear of the unknown. Matthew turned back to Rebecca. What are you going to do with this ring? Rebecca looked at the broken band in her palm, then at Matthew, then at the audience. I think I'm going to keep it, she said, surprising everyone. Not to wear, but to remember that I survived something that tried to break me, and I came out stronger. Jimmy joined them in the audience, clearly moved by what he'd witnessed. Rebecca, how do you feel right now? Like I can breathe, Rebecca said, taking a deep breath that seemed to fill her entire body. Like I remember who I was before I forgot. Matthew reached into his jacket and pulled out a small notebook. Rebecca, I want to write you something. A reminder for when this feeling fades and the fear tries to come back. Live on television, Matthew wrote, Dear Rebecca, tonight you remembered that you are not what happened to you. You are what you choose to become. Your gentleness is your strength. Your freedom is your birthright. He handed it to Rebecca, who carefully folded it and placed it in her purse next to the broken ring. Now, Matthew said, whenever you doubt yourself, whenever the old voices try to convince you that you're not enough, you read that note and remember tonight Remember that 300 people witnessed your transformation and believed in your strength. Rebecca was crying openly, but these weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of recognition, of relief, of the profound joy that comes from remembering who you really are. The three of them sat together for several more minutes, talking about courage, authenticity, and the difference between love and control. When they returned to the stage to finish the interview, everything had changed. Matthew's stories were deeper, Jimmy's questions more thoughtful, and Rebecca had become part of the show, a reminder that every person carries their own version of a broken ring. The show ended differently that night. Instead of the usual goodbye, Jimmy made an announcement that would change how The Tonight Show approached personal transformation. Tonight, we learned something important from Rebecca Martinez, Jimmy said, his voice emotional. We learned that the things we think are protecting us might actually be limiting us. Matthew added, and we learned that courage is contagious. When one person chooses freedom, it gives everyone permission to examine their own chains. Rebecca Martinez returned home the next day with something she hadn't had in 20 years, unshakable belief in her own worth. 6 months later, she was back in school, working toward her teaching degree. A year after that, she was in front of her own classroom, helping children discover things about themselves they didn't know they could do. Matthew became an advocate for domestic violence awareness, establishing a scholarship fund for women returning to education after leaving abusive relationships. The broken wedding ring became a symbol Rebecca carried to shelters, showing other women that broken things could become symbols of triumph rather than defeat. The Tonight Show episode became one of the most shared segments in the show's history, reminding millions that everyone has something they're carrying that no longer serves them. Jimmy learned that sometimes the most important conversations happen with the person in the audience who's ready to break free. It wasn't just late-night television that night. It was a masterclass in recognizing your own worth, understanding the difference between love and control, and remembering that you always have the power to choose who you become. Sometimes freedom looks like taking off a ring. Sometimes it looks like remembering that your hands were meant to create, not just to carry what others have placed there.